Let me propose a hypothetical before we begin. Let's say everyone in this room is a stranger to you. You are tasked with getting to know each other over a very brief period of time, and for your introduction, you must describe a part of your identity that you think defines you. Sounds hard, right? Well, my question is, what would that thing be? What would be the thing that defines you as a person? Would it involve cultural or religious backgrounds, heritage or family trees? Would you talk about who you want to be, what you aspire to do, or the legacy you want to leave behind? Another question, would one of your points center around surviving? By this, I mean something you overcame that gave you life, where your strength is the key reason you are alive today. Something so dangerous and unique that no one else could have experienced it in the way that you did, but also so crucial to who you are now. If I was asked this question, I don't think I would ever be able to give a good enough answer. But today I'm going to attempt to answer this question, but not in the way that you might think. When I was 3 months old, I was diagnosed with a vein of Galen malformation, an extraordinarily rare blood vessel abnormality near the center of the brain. Misshapen arteries connected directly with my veins rather than branching out into the capillaries, which provide the brain with blood. This not only slows blood flow throughout the brain, but also makes it so that the highly oxygenated blood pumps directly back into the veins rather than dispersing throughout the whole brain. The blood that didn't pump directly back into the arteries essentially got stuck in this huge cluster of blood vessels, pooling rather than going where it needed to go. This created immense pressure throughout my circulatory system and forced my heart to work way too hard to get enough blood to my brain. When I was old enough to begin to understand my incomprehensible disease, my father compared it to a sort of plumbing issue within my brain. Some of the pipes did not work as they were supposed to, and those broken pipes or malformed blood vessels essentially needed to be rewired or replumbed, an effort that can take years. My condition can cause heart failure, brain dysfunction, spontaneous bleeding, developmental delay, and if left untreated, is 100% fatal. Pretty scary stuff for a little kid to be dealing with. Now here's what gets even scarier. Beginning when I was 7 months old, I have had 14 brain surgeries, 13 of which happening when I was under the age of 6. I have spent months in and out of hospitals, getting MRIs, CAT scans, IVs, going under anesthesia, and being operated on by teams of doctors. Practically the entire first 6 years of my life were centered around my condition. I endured pain, trauma, and intense treatment infinitely beyond what I could comprehend. I have MRI scans and pictures and videos and stories, but to the little girl sitting on that hospital bed, 10 times too big for her body, her parents at an arm's reach, closing her eyes and ears to block everything out, these mean nothing. But what does mean something is who that little girl turned into after everything. My story starts at Northwestern Prentice Women's Hospital on October 7th, 2006, the day I was born. As soon as I came into this world, I was already different from any other baby in that hospital. A few days after my birth, I was diagnosed with patent ductus arteriosus, an opening between the two major blood vessels in the heart, or a literal hole in your heart that is supposed to close before you are born. Mine did not close, and I spent 10 days in the ICU before I was allowed to go home. What no one knew was that during those first few weeks, my brain was figuring out an entirely different way to drain the blood that was pooling in order to compensate for the disease that no one yet knew I had. Patent ductus arteriosus is a common sign of hypertension or high blood pressure, and this was very likely the first sign of my condition. After the hole closes, I go home and live a normal first few months. My parents then begin to see some coloration developing underneath my right eye. It swells a bit, and it sort of looks like I'm perpetually tired or practice boxing at a very young age. It gets worse. It continues to swell, and my parents take me to a pediatrician to see if anything was wrong. They are told that nothing is wrong. But at this point, it is practically swollen shut, dark purple and incredibly inflamed. We go to more doctors, and they continue to say that I probably just tripped in my crib at night. But with my mother's newfound maternal instinct, she can't let it go. We get in to see a pediatric ophthalmologist who shines a bright light in my eye and is immediately alarmed by the unusual size of the blood vessels within my brain. She orders a CAT scan immediately. This was my first time going under anesthesia. I am 6 months old. My parents were told that the CAT scan would take 45 minutes, yet they sit in that waiting room for more than 2 hours with no word. Finally, a neurosurgeon and his team come out and begin to explain my condition and how rare it is. So rare, in fact, that throughout my treatment, doctors would bring in medical students and residents, point at me, and say, "You will probably never see anything like this again in your career." It was like science class, and I was like the frog the students were dissecting. We were referred to Dr. Bernstein, an interventional radiologist at Mount Sinai Hospital in New York City. Throughout the first few years of my life, I probably spent more time in the hospital than I spent in my own home. My procedures became more and more frequent, and my doctor became somewhat of a friend of mine. Dr. B, as I called him, performed all of my procedures. He would take a catheter, thread it up through my femoral artery, go into each individual blood vessel, check and see if it was still functioning properly, and if it wasn't, he would seal it off with glue. How cool is it that I get to say I have glue in my brain? After waking up, I would spend days recovering on an IV, the machines becoming my lullaby, and then we would go home, the process repeating every few months. I remember a few things from this time in my early childhood, the most prominent being the constant movement of people, machines, and the pounding inside of my small brain. Doctors would examine me closely, and I became something of a specimen to them, a test subject they could see and not touch. But I don't think I was ever completely aware of it, the chaos and stress of the situation. I was too deeply immersed in my small little backyardian and stuffed animal filled world to notice. While my parents were in a state of trauma infinitely beyond what I could ever comprehend, while the doctors stared at me as if I were an animal in a zoo, while the machines beeped loudly and the sticky pads clung to my chest, I was too busy staring up at a bright screen, watching little animated animals sing and move and dance. This, and the support of the people around me, is how I managed to survive. Human interaction became everything to me. After spending days around people, the hustle and bustle overwhelming me with noise, the nurses treating me as if I were an experiment, I became so attached to my family. This was the first thing that started to define me, even as a little girl. I craved being around people, and I think part of this was because of how alone I felt throughout the first few years of my life, even if I didn't know it. I was surrounded by bright lights and machines. Loneliness was inevitable. And although there were always people around me, my parents were the only ones who didn't make me feel alone. This still shows. I panicked when I wouldn't hear them at night, and I took solace in having my eyes on them at all times. I relied so heavily on the people I loved as a kid, partly because it was all I had, and I continue to look for this trust and reliance as I create relationships in high school. And I know exactly where I get this quality from. My 3-month-old self, big eyes staring up at her parents, her guiding stars in a sky of darkness. We are told that the events that happen to us and the things that happen to us are who we are, the things we cannot control. We let those things, those transforming events and occurrences become us. And no matter how, and although we try to make a name for ourselves outside of them, we never or rarely succeed. So to avoid having to be recognized as what I could not control, I stayed quiet. I never told anyone about my condition, and when I did, I made it seem a lot less extreme than it actually was. Part of this might have been my own uncertainty about everything, but I couldn't be known as the girl who had 14 brain surgeries, the girl who almost died. I instead became the quiet one, the tentative one, the one whose best friends sometimes forgot she was there. I became the gentle giant, too scared to stand up or stand out, the one at the back of the classroom. I was too afraid to be different because I was already different enough. I had just barely survived a battle between me and my own brain. So I stayed quiet. This is one of the biggest mistakes I've ever made. I let my condition define me in ways that it shouldn't have. Instead, I should have let what I could control, like my grit, my persistence, lovingness, resilience, determination, and bravery define me instead. I owed it to myself. One of my more recent memories was in 6th grade when I had to go back to New York for my doctor to perform one final checkup in order for him to see if I needed any more treatment or if I was cured. A lot rested on this checkup. My last surgery was about 5 years prior to this, so I had pretty much forgotten everything. It was becoming a more distant part of my life. I was beginning my middle school career, my parents were pursuing what they loved, and my sisters were a part of the equation now too. It sort of felt like it was all just a dream. My life is so normal now, I remember thinking. How could someone like me have been through so much? And that's when the words, "We have to go back to New York for another surgery," hit me like a train. Another one, after all this, I would have to go through more of exactly what I wanted to avoid for the rest of my life rather than face head on, things I couldn't control. We went up to New York and I got ready, watching TV with my parents the night before to take my mind off everything. I remember thinking, what if I die? All of this would have been for nothing. But when I came out of surgery that next morning, the doctors told me something I never thought I'd hear. I was cured, done, finally. The last 13 years of my life were finally over. And that day I realized something. After everything, every treatment, every surgery, I could control this disease. I could control how I acted, and I could let it shape who I am. The strength, the resilience, the crave for love, and the dependence on others are a part of me. And I had just then realized that I had been wasting my time trying to stay quiet. This is who I am. And I understood that I could control it and let it shape me for the rest of my life. So you may ask, how does this story define you? How does it capture your being? How does it show who you truly are in this big world full of people? Well, here's my answer. My story does not define me. It does not provide everything you need to know about me, but it does shape me. It guides me. It brings me closer in understanding who I am as a person. The qualities I gained, the love I received, the people who helped me survive, those are the things that define me. We cannot control what happens to us. We cannot control the events that occur or the pain that we are subject to. But what we can control is how we cope, how we tell the narrative through our own voice. People told me, don't let it define you. Don't let it take over. You're stronger. But then I realized, what if I want it to? What if I want it to shape me? What if I want it to guide me, but still have control over my own voice? What if I want to credit the qualities I've learned to my condition without having to let it define me as a person? And that's where there needs to be a perfect balance. We are not defined by the things that happen to us, but by how we grow from them. We cannot control them, but we can control our outlook on them and who we become. Instead of being the tentative or quiet one, I became stronger and more assertive. Instead of being afraid to be different, I started to understand what it meant to be who I was. I owed it to not only my family, my friends, my loved ones, my doctors, but also to myself. These are the things that you can control. So don't let them control you. Don't let them define you, but let them shape you. Play that survival card and take control of your own narrative. Thank you.